What did they do? A hotel room in the style of a Bulgakov apartment.
That is, not from the apartment. It's like us on the contrary.
It's just that our idea was reworked.
Not yours, but Bulgakov's. Be inspired by the universe of the Master and Margarita with the MTS system, and book a night in a mystical apartment with MTS travel. You can win the most terrible war in the history of mankind and remain a fool at the same time. It is possible to return the economy to a system that has worked for decades, if not centuries, and get a crisis on the scale of Marvel action movies. In the end, you can be remembered in the image of an elderly, unhealthy British bulldog with diction defects, and still remain in the memory of descendants as the greatest hero. Each of us is familiar with Winston Churchill. Films are being made about him. There are monuments to him. Biographers go over the details of his life. And most often we remember exactly what he was like, for example. During his famous speech on the 4th of June of the 40th year, dedicated to the beaches and how to fight on them. He pronounced it with difficulty, and a year later, at the age of 66, he would have his first heart attack. But all this did not prevent his eyes from burning, and Churchill himself remained a cult military leader, who did not give his country, as he himself put it, into the jaws of the tiger, Hitler's Germany, hated by him. In our view, Churchill was born somewhere on the sidelines of the British Parliament, firm where he immediately went to Yalta in Tehran, after which he retired. And although there is absolutely nothing surprising in such a distortion of historical memory towards the Second World War, Churchill still does not come down to it. Hello everyone, I am Yegor Ziryanov, and you are on the Redroom channel, where we talk about the dead and the dead, about history. And let's figure out who this Winston Churchill was outside of his pop image. Churchill Vicor. To begin with, Winston Churchill wasn't always old. We will probably miss his childhood for the most part, because there is nothing particularly interesting about being a school bully, despite all the fun. Moreover, nothing really odious was noticed for our hero, and probably rumors about his terrible behavior were largely provoked by his not the best relationship with his father. And by the bad ones, I mean complete contempt. A letter from Lord Randolph Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, to his son when he did enter the military academy for the 3rd year. It is customary to say here that Churchill was so upset by this that at that moment he decided to prove to himself, to his father, to England and to heaven itself that he was capable of more. It was this incredible will that led Winston Churchill to all further successes. But you know, let's be honest, Churchill is not a self-made man in our modern sense with such and such relatives. However, this does not detract from his merits, but nevertheless let's leave the pathos of the biographer. By the way, there is a popular myth that the problems in the Churchill family were caused by the fact that Lord Randolph already had syphilis in the terminal stage, and that his cap naturally leaked, which apparently prevented him from communicating normally with the household, but did not prevent him from speaking in the House of Lords. In general, most likely this is nonsense invented by Winston's literary agent, with whom they quarreled at some point, and who loved to endow many of his contemporaries with fictional syphilis. I think it's time to defend the honor of the long-dead Duke of Marlborough and turn to the long-dead Frank Harris. Frank Harris, you know what? Who has what hurts? That's it. Friends, did you know that Akira Kurosawa is the very person without whose samurai fighters we would not have seen a huge number of famous westerns, and whose films George Lucas was inspired by? Actually managed to work with Mosfilm, and even made a film of Siberia with him in collaboration. This is one of the facts from the course of cinema through the eyes of directors, from the synchronization of one of the largest lecture halls in Russia. Naturally, everything is not limited to cinema here. You can find more than 600 hours of lectures, in as many as 16 directions. Of course, history, literature, art, and much more. For example, the course I mentioned examines the work of 18 directors, each of whom is devoted to an hour-and-a-half lecture, designed in the style of each of these directors. So if you want to figure out why some films remain in history and others do not, learn how to analyze movies, and close the question for yourself for a long time, and what is it to watch tonight, then welcome. But if you are interested not only in movies, but also in something else, then pay attention to the synchronization subscription, which allows you to take any courses for a whole year, not to rest, studying and learning something new. Perhaps you are interested in the history of religion, or you want to learn how to listen to classical music and understand it. All this is on sync. The tariff will simply make available video, audio, Telegram courses, webinars, and new launches. In short, a lot of things. And for the whole year ahead, you will have an interesting, useful, and not boring lesson in the company of professional lecturers. There will be something to fuck with the fan. And to make it even more pleasant, use a super profitable promo code Redroom. With it, an annual subscription to all synchronization courses will cost as much as 65% cheaper, 22,800 rubles instead of 57,000. It is more profitable to take a subscription than to pay for courses separately, especially since it includes webinars that cannot be purchased separately. And you can pay as you like, by card from Russia or from abroad, the entire amount at once or in installments 4 times every 2 weeks for 5,700. Follow the link in the description, purchase a subscription, and entrust your leisure time to synchronization. In any case, while Winston was young, he was running around the world in search of fame. His first successful role is a young, lean warrior who is always where the attention of the nation is directed. Churchill, as a military man, managed to visit, it seems, all the fronts of his beloved British colonial empire. But he became famous there not as a soldier, but as a journalist and war correspondent. 1895th year. Spanish Cuba. The locals rebelled against the European colonialists. 21-year-old Winston has an assignment from British intelligence to evaluate the actions of new bullets used by the Spanish army. And from the Daily Telegraph newspaper, he has an order for a series of reports. Churchill had already managed not only to become a second lieutenant of the 4th Hussar Regiment, but also to become disillusioned with boring army life, so the Cuban uprising pulled him out of idleness. In Cuba, Winston, in pursuit of the first medal, the Spanish Small Cross, at the same time received the first newspaper royalties. By the way, it's quite ironic that this most famous Englishman in the world did not receive his first award from his native kingdom at all. After returning to the Old World, his regiment was sent to India. Winston had nothing to do there, everything was quiet in the Asian colonies, and he wanted to be at war, closer to the front line. For example, in Egypt. There, General Kitchener, worthy of a separate issue, was just preparing for a campaign against the Sudanese rebels. Or at least in Crete, where the Greeks were fighting the Turks. In short, at least somewhere away from the boring Indian reality. Although you know what? To be honest, this phrase makes me feel like an oxymoron, because usually Indian reality is associated with some kind of TikToks, where an elephant, juggling fireballs, roasts some strange food on the roof of an old British train, plastered with thousands of Indians. But maybe it's just me, I don't know. If you want to get your own idea of Indian everyday life, or, like Winston Churchill, you are looking for a way to dispel boredom, then you can also fly to India, Egypt or Cyprus, just by cheap flights on air sales. However, there was no need to leave. An uprising of Pashtun tribes began in the north, and the Hussars were sent to suppress it. 22-year-old Churchill had already commanded scouts, and was able to distinguish himself on the battlefield. However, he did it in the most idiotic way possible, riding 3 times under a hail of enemy bullets. He wrote to his mother, "I was riding a pony along the firing line, while everyone else was lying and hiding. Maybe it's stupid, but I'm playing big." And you know, on the whole, this describes quite well the views of the young Churchill on military affairs in general. At the same time, Winston continued to send home reports, but for a more solid newspaper, yes, or the Telegraph. Where did he get such offers at all, you ask? Well, in addition to his father, a famous and influential duke, he also had a mother with connections in the publishing world. In general, Winston had no problems with his first reporting assignments, just like with education, social status, you know, relatives and all that. However, he survived everything possible from his starting data. After the suppression of the Pashtun uprising, Churchill began to get bored in India again. And first, he wrote a book about the war, then a fiction novel, but somehow all this did not amuse him enough. And he decided to become a real writer and began to drink. Yes, he became interested in alcohol in India, and immediately for life. However, despite the fact that we used to associate it with a glass of whiskey, as a rule, it was limited to this very glass. And a lot of water. During the entire Second World War, with all its stresses and shocks, he was seen drunk only once. As they say, a note to the hostess. Drink water, friends. Churchill made his next dash for glory in Africa. With the help of his mother and his personal perseverance, he managed to get transferred to Egypt to fight against the Sudanese rebels. The war in India was dirty, with the massacre of civilians and the massacre of prisoners, but the war in Africa was even worse. The wounded rebels were finished off or left to die, and the grave of their leader, who was called Mahdi, implying that he was a saint, was desecrated, his head was cut off, and his body was burned in the oven. Churchill wrote all this in great detail in his book The Messiah of the Dune. Okay, the book is called The War on the River, and it deserves to be mentioned in fact, if only because it has become not just famous. It has become a real all-British bestseller. And, as they say, who is Listen Algae here now? By the way, Listen Algae was the name of a poet, as I read at Wildfield. Here. So it's a double joke, friends. For his third war in 2 years, the Boer War, Winston Churchill went to the already famous journalists, but continued to reach the front line. In 1899, the Browns besieged the city of Ladysmith, and Churchill tried to break into it, on a steam locomotive. He and his squad were ambushed, from which the train with the British barely escaped, and Churchill distinguished himself here. Under fire, he helped clean up the derailed platforms, cleared the way, brought out the train, and then decided to go back for the wounded, and then he was captured by the Boers. Since he lost his pistol, and had the correspondence documents with him, he began to prove with a drill that he was not a military man at all, but a journalist, and they had no right to hold him captive. However, soon he was shown British newspapers, in which Churchill was glorified as a hero for the story with the locomotive. And after that, the militant correspondent was sent to Pretoria, where he was placed in prison with other prisoners of war. Soon he agreed with 2 prisoners to escape. One of them knew Dutch, the other had a compass with him, but in the end only Churchill of all 3 escaped, who had neither a compass, nor maps, nor knowledge of the language. But fools are lucky. I'm the best example, if anything. When Churchill returned to England after the war, he was greeted with applause. Everyone was talking about the journalist officer. His books sold out in huge circulations, and his fees, which initially amounted to tens and hundreds of pounds, turned into fees of thousands of pounds. And I remind you that it was the same pound backed by gold, friends. In Africa, he was paid as much as no journalist had ever been paid before. He went to North America on a lecture tour. In the 1900th year, his portrait appeared in more than 100 newspapers, an unprecedented media for that time. And then anyone who has heard of Winston Churchill, in response to a question about him, would tell you something. Oh, well, yes. This is a famous reporter. He writes about the horrors in the colonies. Churchill is a racist. Yes, let's talk about another aspect of Sir Winston Churchill's historical reputation. About his attitude towards the indigenous inhabitants of British, and not only British colonies. Scandals around the figure of Churchill, in principle, have not stopped for more than a century, but the current round is perhaps more significant than the previous ones. Once newspapers made fun of him alive, but now activists are taking revenge on his monument. And then the pop image of Churchill is blurred to a state of unrecognizability. In addition to the cigar and the Victor sign, there are real claims of the living generations to the historical heritage of the Prime Minister. He is accused of racism, of imperialism, of genocide in India, of war crimes in Africa, of anything but. And at the same time, he managed to participate in so many events and in so many places that it is really quite difficult to separate truth from fiction, but we will try. I must say that Churchill, of course, was, as they say, an imperialist or an imperialist, as you like. The term is in any case quite useless. Imperialism was the aggregate state of the British conservatives of the late 19th century, and Churchill, of course, also believed in empire. He grew up in a society that reasonably considered itself advanced and on a global scale. Young Churchill found the peak of the greatness of his homeland in the last decades of the Victorian era. His belief in the empire stemmed from the belief that Great Britain is the greatest force for good and peace of all available. Of all the available ones, apparently the key one. By the way, the first thing Churchill did after he entered his office after being appointed minister of the colonies. He put a small bronze bust of Napoleon on the table. Next, was Churchill a racist? Of course, Churchill was a racist, quite within the standard of his era. The only question here is how much he went beyond this very frame at all. And here, they really like to quote some of his quotes. And as you know, with the invention of the internet, these quotes have become, well, many times more than before. They say that here is a churchman describing how he shot a modest in the face, and here he is then, telling how his hussars cut out a village from the Pashtuns somewhere there. But for most of these quotes, as a rule, there is a refutation, and, as a rule, in the adjacent sentence. Yes, in 95% of cases, Churchill simply described the atrocities, and often even condemned them. And sometimes he just hyped on a beneficial topic, because, you know, he was a journalist, and even in the 19th century, in the homeland of the tabloid. Just for a second. And, of course, terminology also complicates this dispute, because 120 years later, it is, oddly enough, quite difficult to argue which of all this should be considered a war crime. And the most difficult thing here is how to define genocide. This word is generally very fond of throwing. The most serious accusations against Churchill are made in India. In 1943, a terrible famine occurred in Bengal, and 3 million of its victims allegedly lie on the conscience of the British Prime Minister, who did not want to lose the pearl from the crown of his beloved empire for anything. Today it became clear that the cause of the famine was not the British. It was the Japanese occupation of neighboring Burma, the main source of food for Bengal. And of course, all this is combined with bad weather. Despite this, of course, one cannot ignore the fact that the UK refused to redirect humanitarian supplies from Europe to India, and also rejected Canada's offer to send additional food aid to Bengalis. And although this could be justified, given the shortage of ships in the Indian Ocean, and given the Japanese submarines, it is still difficult to justify the inaction of the metropolis. Yes, and about the imperial claims. Of course, Churchill imagined the success of Indian separatism with horror, but on the other hand, there is such a quote. Mr. Gandhi has risen very high in my esteem since he stood up for the untouchables. For all his Victorian racism, Churchill feared that the disintegration of India would lead to disaster for the local pariahs. As Minister of the Colonies, he did not allow arbitrary executions and condemned punitive expeditions. In the end, he even managed to turn South Africa, where the dirty Anglo-Boer War had just ended, into a peaceful dominion like Canada or New Zealand. And here's another quote from Churchill. I strongly advocate the use of poison gas against uncivilized tribes. The moral effect should be so good as to minimize human casualties. This was his recipe for the pressure of a popular uprising in mandatory Iraq after the First World War. And this is certainly barbaric. Only here there is a continuation. It is possible to use gases that cause great inconvenience and cause live horror, but at the same time, do not leave serious irreversible consequences for the majority of victims. Also, in general, not Tolstoyism, but also not as bloodthirsty as it might initially seem, isn't it? In general, in my opinion, this is enough to form some idea of who he really was. But if you want to seriously judge Comrade Churchill after the fact, then get ready for the fact that everything will be difficult. And I just wish you to conduct this incredible historical discussion without using paint cans. Unsuccessful politician, although Churchill's texts were certainly good and certainly profitable, his career as a correspondent attracted him solely as a springboard on the road to something more. Yes, I understand, this is a very unexpected turn, like Churchill, a politician, all that, but wait, there's something to talk about here too. That's what's interesting. In contrast to a super successful writing career, Churchill's political career, in general, often went to the bone in a criff. And there were failures and failures in it, well, no less than successes and ups. And often they were such failures that they overshadowed all his victories. In the 1890s, young Winston had a plan to earn a reward for bravery in some war and, thanks to it, be elected to Parliament. The plan is risky, but in any case, it is more interesting than traditional politics. You know, decades of working with the electorate, building reputation, party work. Churchill wanted to get into Parliament externally, through the war, bypassing all this. Back on his return to England from India, where he earned his first military awards, Churchill stood as a candidate for the House of Commons from the small town of Alden. He actively joined the election campaign, spoke 8 times a day, and in the process discovered that he not only writes well, but also speaks beautifully. The reputation of a hero of the war with the modest and medals turned out to be very appropriate. Churchill's discovered oratorical talent was not hindered even by the fact that, generally speaking, he had a terrible lisp. He was offered to fix it, but he refused. And either he did it in vain, or he did not have enough combat awards, but he eventually lost the election. He conceded, however, to the winner quite a bit, so for 25 years, in principle, the result is not the worst. And you could have gone to Wojtyszka. This is not an ad-liner, by the way, lol. He tried again after the Boer War in the same town of Alden, but this time, he had a really cool trump card. Cool story. When Churchill escaped from Boer captivity, he had to improvise. He sneaked onto a freight train, got as far away from the prison as possible, jumped off it in the middle of the night, and knocked on the first house where there was light. And it turned out that mining workers from England live in this house. And not just from somewhere, but from the very town of Old, who, having heard that their candidate for deputy literally fell on their head, immediately promised to vote for him, if they even live to see this moment. Well, Churchill lived to see it. He spent several days in the mine, then he was hidden in bales of wool and sent on a train that went from Transvaal to Mozambique. And then he returned to the active army for the Boer War, both as an officer and as a correspondent. This is the story that Churchill put at the center of his election campaign and did not lose. In the autumn of 1900, he became for the first time a member of the House of Commons from the Conservative Party. There, the young deputy immediately attracted everyone's attention. Clarity of thought, clarity of wording, and a very good sense of humor made Winston Churchill one of the most prominent speakers in Parliament. However, it quickly became clear that Winston is a politician. In general, quarrelsome internal party discipline is not for him. Winston Churchill was, you know, broader than any views and ideologies. Don't worry, if necessary, we will upload an 80-hour version of this video to YouTube. Soon he quarreled with the Conservatives on a lot of issues, moved to the bench of the Liberal Party, and began to smash yesterday's friends of the same party in his speeches. The Conservative Daily Mail, on which he worked for so long, described him as a radical with a bright red tint. Once again, Winston Churchill is a red radical. I remind you that we are talking about a man who invented the term Iron Curtain, and is considered one of the main anti-communists in history. In this regard, he competes, probably only, I do not know, with Reagan, Senator McCarthy, and with a random person from Twitter with an avatar with an anime girl. In general, Churchill had no problems with the media, but it took time to fit into the British establishment. Well, for a while, you know, I can't say that for him it was just too difficult for everyone in the world. The really big politics for him began after 1908. Churchill changed his political party very timely. The era of conservative rule in the UK was ending, and soon the majority in Parliament passed to the Liberals, who began to form a government. And Churchill, who switched to the side of the winners in time, entered it. First, he became President of the Trade Council, and then Minister of the Interior. Churchill's peculiarity was that he did not abandon his extravagance in the world of big politics. Yes, in general, he conducted business in marches. He took everything on himself and tried to distinguish himself everywhere. Every post for the ambitious Churchill was an occasion to try to realize his ambitions, you know, to do something great. But somehow it didn't work out regularly. For example, he was remembered as the head of the Interior Ministry, not because of the humane prison reform, not because of the new classification of crimes introduced there, but because of a completely ridiculous story about a shootout on Sydney Street. Let's be brief. 3 criminals, 2 Britons, and a certain Russian anarchist, with a wonderful name, Peter the artist personally. I think that this is the previous reincarnation of Pavlensky, committed an armed robbery and killed 3 policemen. The police surrounded them in a mansion on Sydney Street. The anarchists began to shoot back. Churchill's London house was nearby, and Winston, of course, immediately ran to the scene, not forgetting to bring a photographer with him. When they arrived, the house was already on fire. Churchill began commanding firefighters, and the photographer was filming the whole thing. But the media got a picture in which the Minister of Internal Affairs boldly and resolutely looks out from around the corner. The whole of England laughed at the ridiculous Churchill. Opponents in Parliament said they could understand what the photographer was doing there. But what the minister was doing there is beyond their understanding. Churchill is the commander of the capture group, or, excuse me, the fire chief. It is clear that the minister was doing there, but at that time, it was not very accepted, and as a result, shots of him heroically peeking around the corner began to be shown in cinemas before the start of films for the sake of laughter. By the way, it's a wonderful practice. I think it needs to be returned. In countries with real elections, this can become an agitation tool, and in countries where elections are fictitious, it will multiply the effect of surreal cringe. Churchill is a great original and inventor. Nevertheless, his political career was on the rise. He received the post of First Lord of the Admiralty, became the creator of British naval aviation, and the author of the term hydroplane. But 3 years later, his career would collapse. In October 1914, it became clear that the war on the Western Front was coming to a standstill. There was an idea that the course of the war could be reversed if an unexpected blow was struck for the Germans in another place. And so there was a plan for the ill-fated Dardanelles operation, the landing of the Entente troops in the Turkish rear. We have a separate video about this, so we will not dwell on it in detail, but in general, the landing in Gallipoli turned into a disaster and the absolutely senseless death of 250,000 British, Australians, New Zealanders, and other Entente soldiers. And Churchill was left to blame for what happened. He immediately lost the post of First Lord of the Admiralty. Outraged, Winston demanded the publication of a shorthand of military negotiations. He wanted everyone to see that the decision was not only his, and that the others supported this idea. However, everyone was quite satisfied that only Churchill was to blame, so he was banned from publication. He will then be shouted from the crowd for a long time during performances in the spirit of What About the Dardanelles? Then the records were published, historians thoroughly dug into them, and agreed that the decision was still collegial. Moreover, Churchill did not even immediately support this idea. At first, he offered to capture an island off the coast of Germany, covering the landing of Russian troops near Berlin. But then changed his mind and supported the attack on Turkey. And that's when everyone constantly changed their minds, then supporting the operation, then opposing it, so, as you understand. But since Winston, with his obsession with great achievements, demanded more than anyone to act decisively, and made the loudest statements to the press, and in general, it was somehow characteristic of him. He was not afraid to take responsibility. He was eventually entrusted with all this responsibility. For Winston, it was, in general, a blow, because all his life, he dreamed of doing something meaningful, something great. Finally found himself in the center of great events, and something went wrong. And here he is still over 40, and there will be no more such a great, nightmarish powerful war for him to distinguish himself. That's no second chance. It's sad, in general, it's all sad. By the way, it was then that he began to draw to distract himself from all these thoughts. And that's why we know that it's better when a politician starts painting than when the opposite happens. And then Churchill went to the Western Front. He wanted to command a brigade there, but they only gave him a battalion. In the late autumn of 1915, he found himself in the trenches and met his 41st birthday there. Churchill surprised his subordinates by showing up in the trenches with a bathtub and a boiler for heating water. And at first they were wary of him because they understood that the disgraced politician had come to make amends for his reputational damage. But then it turned out that Winston was an old soldier, a really good battalion commander. He started a campaign against lice. He read for the sake of raising the immoral spirit of Burns' soldiers, because he served in a regiment of Scottish Fusiliers. All the time I was inventing some innovations for the trenches. And soon he was respected and even loved. And Churchill seems to have finally found peace of mind. And while he was sitting in this trench, under shells and bullets. But in the end I remembered my military youth, but this happiness did not last long. In the war, people like Churchill, responsible and energetic, were very much needed in the leadership, not in the trenches. So 6 months later, he was moved from these very trenches to the chair of the Minister of Armaments. And in this position he met victory. In 1919, Churchill was appointed Minister of War. In addition to demobilizing a huge army and suppressing unrest in Ireland, he had to decide what to do with British troops in Russia. There were 13,000 in the north and thousands of people in Siberia. And here again, the character of Churchill affected. He did not send these troops to Russia, but he still had the reputation of being the main anti-Soviet. Why? And because he demanded, as always, the most decisive and the loudest actions. While his colleagues were babbling about something, messing around, discussing something, he said that recognizing Soviet power was the same as recognizing sodomy. So it meant that troops should be urgently led to Soviet Russia, and Lenin and Trotsky would be overthrown. Naturally, all these bold projects were destroyed, but the simple fact that the British actually simply did not want to fight for any democratic values there, or for the Tsarist God have mercy on Russia, or for neither against the Soviet Union, nor for freedom, nor for the future, just for nothing. Please leave me alone. So no one has introduced any troops anywhere, but Churchill has earned a reputation as the main anti-Soviet for many years. As colonial secretary, he signed the treaty establishing the Irish Free State, and as chancellor tried to tie the pound sterling to the gold standard again. And so it seemed that nothing worse could happen to Churchill's reputation than the Dardanelles operation, but no decision in Churchill's entire career was more criticized than the gold standard. And here we will have to make a small explanation of why this is criticism. Regarding the gold standard, in general, it is largely true. And if you have some basic ideas about the economy, or you, for example, watched at least our video about the Great Depression, or you are frequent viewers in the admin, you can just skip this piece by time code. For everyone else, we explain on our fingers. The gold standard is a monetary system in which anyone can take a piece of paper printed by the state, with the face of the God Emperor on it, and, as it were, go and exchange it for a certain amount of gold. Accordingly, if you are a state, then you can't just click the Make Money button on the magic printer in the treasury to get more money, obviously, because the exchange rate of this piece of your money to gold is fixed. And if you want more money, it means we need more gold. Quote from Warcraft 3 for all occasions. But that's the problem. Sometimes, for example, in a crisis or in a catastrophic war that has taken over half the world, you need to press a button and make a branch. Yes, this will cause inflation and cause devaluation, the depreciation of your national currency in relation to others. Because there will suddenly be dramatically more money, but all this is not so important. If this money goes into normal circulation inside the country, the central bank will print pieces of paper, reduce the key rate, issue loans to private banks, and those will finance businesses and enterprises that will bring real goods, services, products, technologies, and so on. Yes, it will be somewhat more expensive for you to import something, since the exchange rate against a foreign currency is likely to fall. But this is not so important in general. Bourgeois florins will be more expensive, but these bourgeois florins will be brought to you by the bourgeois themselves, as payment for your production or, say, as an investment. The other problem, besides the inability to manipulate the course, is that we need more gold. More precisely, you don't just need more gold, you need at least the gold you have in the treasury, not to leak anywhere in a free order. And the main tool to achieve this is again the key rate. We keep it high. Loans begin to be given reluctantly. The money supply does not grow, but rather falls along with prices. And we get deflation, not inflation. Moreover, if they fall quickly, sharply or very strongly, then you can be trapped when the manufacturer starts selling less and earning less money. Because of this, he dismisses employees, they now have no work and no money to buy something. And it is again unprofitable for the manufacturer to produce something. And that's it. This closes in a hellish circle, in which only foreign manufacturers of antidepressants become beneficiaries. And mind you, I'm not even starting a conversation about the fact that gold actually tends to change its price. But how did it work, then, throughout the Victorian era before the First World War? Because the British pound, which was reliably secured with gold, was freely exchanged for this very gold. How? Well, here the answer is quite simple. Her Majesty's mining workers mined most of the gold in the world. Her Majesty's red uniformed soldiers painted a third of the world map in the colors of the British flag. And Her Majesty's London bankers sat in the financial center of the world and carefully watched where the golden rain should fall, and where it can only slightly drip. When most of the international trade is not carried out without your participation, all this is quite feasible. The First World War destroyed this idol in one moment, simply because it took an incredible amount of money. First, free exchanges were removed and gold coins were withdrawn from circulation, and after the Great War, the gold standard in England was completely abolished. The world conflict had become too stressful for Old England. London could no longer play a centralizing financial role, and New York was already moving it to leadership positions with might and main. The world felt all the problems of the gold standard described by me after the First World War. There, some of the countries that had a trade surplus, which were richer, began to accumulate this gold, proactively fight inflation, disperse the price of this gold with this demand for it, of course, while small countries, on the contrary, or simply those who could not afford a trade surplus of a poorer country, simply they were saying goodbye to their gold reserves. They parted with gold and got deflation in pursuit. But, apparently, all this was not enough to realize the scale of the problems. The gold standard was not massively abolished then, because it apparently required another world war. In 1925 year, our dear Winston Churchill, on the contrary, decided to try to turn the stuffing in the opposite direction, and returned the gold standard in England. And under the military course, only the empire was no longer what it used to be, and the pound could no longer be worth as much. Britain was a participant in the same race for gold as other countries. The export of the British has become rapidly worse, but Britain is more than England. At the time of the 25th year, it is still a huge part of the world, so it is not surprising that such a decision by Sir Churchill became the last nail in the coffin of the world economy of the interbellum era. There was no stopping the deflationary trend. That already in 1929 will largely become a factor in the worst economic crisis of the 20th century. The Great Depression in the United States. And the Great Depression. This is not only dismissal, closure of enterprises, unemployment and poverty all over the world, it is also dismissal, closure of enterprises, unemployment and poverty all over the world, which were fully exploited by the rearing totalitarian regimes, in particular those who were very keen on revanchist sentiments after the Great War. In general, for those who missed it, the financial reform led to severe economic consequences. Because of the crisis, the Liberal government collapsed, and at that moment, Churchill himself was on the operating table with appendicitis. He will then write about it, that at one point, he found himself without a place, without a party, and without an appendix. Meanwhile, the post-war world, interbellum, still had no idea what was waiting for it literally tomorrow, and was filled with the most optimistic ideas about the future. Yes, now it looks sad and funny, like the world optimism of the 90s, with their end of history and everything else. The League of Nations, all sorts of conferences on disarmament, the removal of trade barriers between countries. It seemed that a new happy time was coming for humanity, where there would no longer be a place for such madness as a world war. And Churchill, with his, energetic pressure, constant readiness for any decisive action, to take troops somewhere, or finally bang bombs for some reason, was somehow inappropriate. He bought an estate for himself, wrote books there, painted pictures, traveled, and in general everything went well. But history has shown us that it is possible to be with such a scuffling peasant after 50 and still achieve great things. We just need a good little war. By the way, I do not advise you to take this lesson literally. In the 30s, the beautiful peaceful world cracked at the seams. The dictators of the new nationalist Europe were wiping their feet on the policy of appeasement to which British politicians were committed. Munich and the strange war left no stone unturned from the reputation of the Chamberlain government, and it collapsed. Churchill not only painted pictures all these years, he constantly demanded the strengthening of the army, the growth of armaments, a decisive rebuff by the aggressor, and at first they brushed him off, then they began to listen to him, and soon they invited him back to power. What if it was all Winston Churchill's plan, huh? On the 10th of May, 1940th year, when the German troops launched an offensive against the Benelux. Churchill was summoned by the king. Winston left Buckingham Palace as Prime Minister. Fate gave him what he probably no longer hoped for: a second chance at greatness, a new great war. And he, as we all know, took full advantage of this chance. Churchill is a hero of the Second World War. Regarding the Second World War, let's say about two things related personally to the role of Churchill. Firstly, there is an opinion that if he had not been made Prime Minister then, the war with Germany could have stopped already in the 40th year. Allegedly, Hitler made two very explicit invitations to an armistice. Well, apart from the fact that he verbally repeatedly stated that he did not want to fight with Great Britain. First of all, a stop order that allowed the British, pressed to the sea, to evacuate from Dunkirk. Secondly, the mysterious flight of Hesse to England, about which a lot of things are said, but there is a version that, they say, in this way the Nazis wanted to offer Great Britain peace. This is how the British would have fought Hitler if it hadn't been for the irrepressible Winston Churchill, because Hitler himself said that everything would have been fine if it hadn't been for one damn old alcoholic. But you know, most likely Comrade Hitler was still wrong. Because firstly, a lot of blood had already been shed at that time, and secondly, there is such a small suspicion that the Allies fought with Hitler's Germany after all, not only because of one damn old alcoholic. But that's just my guess. The second interesting point is the relationship with Stalin. Churchill visited Moscow in the 42nd, and the conference became a most difficult challenge for him, where Comrade Djugashvili endlessly pressed the British Prime Minister with demands to open a second front. 4 hours later, Churchill got so angry and replied to the great Kormchev that he forgives such rudeness only because of the bravery of Soviet soldiers. In general, it is believed that Stalin, with whom no one had talked like that for 20 years, at that moment, was imbued with great respect for Churchill, and that at the end of the conference, the two parted almost as friends, having, of course, managed to be drinking buddies. In general, the closer the victory was, the harder it became for Churchill. He was absolutely at ease at the very beginning, when it was necessary to stand to the death and not give up. But in the end, when the British needed to land troops on the continent, the massacre in Gallipoli clearly rose before Churchill's eyes. He was so worried about the outcome of the case that he even wanted to personally participate in the landing, as he once did in his youth. And, of course, the 70-year-old Prime Minister was not allowed into battle, and the landing in Normandy itself was successful, like all other operations up to the act of surrender in Berlin. Churchill is the loser. The winner. The main paradox of Winston Churchill's life is that he won the war and lost the world. That's how they usually write about him in all biographies. The military triumphant Churchill lost in the elections of the 45th year, even before the surrender of Japan. And the labor leader Clement Attlee went to Potsdam to fight the World War. In fact, Churchill's defeat in the elections in the 45th was laid back in the war years. Even during the Battle of Battles, political life in Britain did not stop. People demanded reforms back in the 42nd. Churchill, as Prime Minister, was forced to respond to these demands, made speeches on the radio. But everyone who heard them understood. Winston Churchill was not particularly interested in all this. He saved Britain, defeated the Nazis, liberated Europe. Well, what are the tax rates against all this? Well, what kind of social guarantees? What kind of welfare state in general? All of this didn't sound exciting to him at all, and the voters felt it. You know, it's hard to think about a country when a future history textbook is already being written in your head. In the 40s and 40s, his approval rating of the Prime Minister never fell below 78%. But as soon as the war ended, he immediately lost the election. The party issue also played a role. The fact is that Churchill was nominated by the Conservative Party, which once belonged to the same Chamberlain, who completely screwed up before the Second World War. And while during the war Churchill led, as it were, all the English hawks, they somehow did not pay attention to this. But after the war, they began to remember the old sins of the Conservatives. Curiously, Churchill himself clearly understood the reasons for his defeat perfectly well. There is a story about how someone near him mentioned, they say, that's what an ungrateful British people are. And Churchill replied that, they say, come on, it's not about the people at all, and not about Churchill himself. It's just that these people have a lot of new other problems. He remained in politics for a long time, was the leader of the Conservative Party and the head of the parliamentary opposition, and then even became Prime Minister again in the second half of the 50s and raised a new young Queen Elizabeth. By the way, we have a separate video about her. But then age took its toll and Winston went into private life. For the past decade, he has been a monument to himself. The greatest Briton in world history has died, as he was recognized by the BBC listeners in 2002 years, at the age of 90 from a stroke. Well, I'm going to ask you to click like under this video, and the subscribe button if you still haven't done it. And also about the fact that you can subscribe to our Busty and Patreon, in order not to see integrative advertising. In order to communicate with us in a closed Telegram chat, and in order to see the videos the very first. And also just to support us, if you want to support us. Thanks to everyone who is already doing this. Thanks to the rest of the viewers who watch these videos. Don't forget to make your sacrifices to YouTube algorithms, and we'll see you soon. Somewhere. At the level of the face, it should be clearly visible.